Okay, I think we'll start. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joanne Jockey with Conservation Ontario. Hope you're all very well. Welcoming you to this presentation for CAs about the third edition of the Breeding Bird Atlas of Ontario. We have Mike Cadman and his colleague, Kaylin Boumelis, with us today from the Canadian Wildlife Service, and Mike is going to give the presentation. Kristen Bristow of Conservation Ontario is also helping us manage the technology today, so thank you very much, Kristen. A few housekeeping items to remind you about before we get started. You're all on mute, but just in case, just keep, for those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, there are places in the box at the right-hand corner where you can mute yourself. If you're not muted, you can work on the bottom. There's also on your device, of course, too, you can make sure that you're muted. We want to give courtesy to Mike, who's giving the presentation today, and prevent any background noise. We also, as far as questions go, you can ask questions throughout on the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. The comment box, you'll see chat. And Kaylin will be responding to questions throughout the presentation, and we hope to have time at the end for questions as well. Mike will be giving the presentation about the Bird Atlas, what the opportunities and benefits to Conservation Ontario and CAs are of collaborating, and we'll speak about next steps. This presentation is also being recorded for your colleagues and other CA staff who haven't been able to attend today. So without further ado, Mike.
Thanks very much, Joanne. Really appreciate this, and thanks to everyone for attending today and hearing about the Atlas. So at the title here, you can see 2021 to 2025. That's actually the data collection period for the Atlas, but the Atlas is actually 8 years long, and we're in the preparatory year this year, 2020. We'll do the 5 years of data collection, then there's a couple of years putting together, cleaning up the data, getting it all into published form. So it'll be late 2027 or 2028 by the time the final product's actually out there. Just to let you know that the Ontario Atlas is one of a whole raft of atlases across the country, right from Newfoundland to BC. And the schedule here sort of shows the breakdown. We have a national or a Canadian Breeding Bird Atlas committee that schedules these things. We're trying to get away from having too many going at the same time because they all run through Birds Canada, and we're trying not to overwhelm them. And at the same time give the volunteers a nice break in between. So Atlases run, as you can see here, on a roughly 20-year basis. So Ontario's had those previous ones in 1980 and in 2001, sorry, in 2001, and then the next one will be 2021. So 2 books published so far, and of course, as well as the books, there's a large database that's available on the Birds Canada website. All the data is available for anybody who wants access to it, and would encourage any of you who are interested in the Atlas data to follow up and look into that. And of course, the same is true of the new upcoming Atlas. All the data is going to be on that site and available to folks who want to use it. So the goals of the project, you probably get the idea from an atlas, but as it says here, it's all about mapping the distribution and relative abundance of the birds of the province in this 5-year period, and we want to compare that back to those 2 earlier atlases, back to the 1980s, basically. Part of the work is going to allow us to estimate population sizes, and again we can compare that to the 2 previous atlases, see how those things have changed over time. And you may have heard some of the work that's gone on continent-wide, where we've lost 3 billion birds over the last 40 years, and this will really bring us up to date on exactly what's happening in Ontario. Of course, a big part of the Atlas, we have all these people out in the field collecting data. They're coming across lots of rare and interesting species, species at risk, so we make a special effort to collect information on those. At this time, we are going to try to expand our coverage in Northern Ontario. We've always covered the whole province right to the top end, but there's new technologies now allowing us to do some new things in the north that we're going to be expanding this time. And then, of course, the bottom point there at the end, really, it's all about getting the data out there for folks to use for research and conservation purposes, and lots of different applications there for the Atlas data. I should say another thing that's sort of the hidden agenda here is to get people involved in birding. We want to get the birding community out there taking advantage of the skill set. There's a huge number of very talented folks across the province know a lot about birds, and we want to make sure, well, we want to steer them into helping us collect the information that will be useful for the Atlas project. So the Atlas has quite a structure behind it. We have a management committee, which is made up of the 5 partners that sponsor the project. So Birds Canada, Canadian Wildlife Service, Ontario Region, Ontario Field Ornithologists, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and Ontario Nature. And then we have different working groups working for different committees. And that, at the moment, we have a working group planning out the strategy for the Atlas. Exactly what is it that we're trying to accomplish this time, and how do we best go about that? And we have a special group looking at Indigenous engagement. And then under that is a series of committees. The green layer here are committees. The significant species group sort of tells us which species we ought to be collecting extra information on, and then ensures that that data does get collected, and then screens it and reviews it and makes sure that that data is good. Our volunteer management committee is helping us reach out to the volunteers and helping keep them happy, basically, making sure we get the maximum efficiency and effectiveness out of that group. Our technical committee is really about designing the project and then analyzing the data at the end. And they have 2 subcommittees. We would definitely take a different approach in the north and the south. And so we have a separate subcommittee looking at how we should be doing Northern Ontario. And within that, there's numerous components to covering the north. Of course, the big part of it is how are we going to get people in and out of all these areas. So we have a logistics group that's helping us figure those kind of things out. And then the other part of the technical committee is this design and analysis subcommittee that's currently very busy trying to make final decisions, tweaking the approach from last time. How can we improve it? How have new technologies come along that we can take advantage of, and how do we best use those to get the results we're after? We have a fundraising and finance committee. Obviously, they're all about raising enough resources to keep the project running. And we have a communications group, especially with modern communications. It's helpful to have some folks that know all about social media, and they're in the process of figuring out the sort of launch of the project. How are we going to reach out to the birding community in particular, and others, but particularly to the birding community on the project. We have 2 staff, Kaylin and I. Kaylin's actually with Birds Canada. I'm with Canadian Wildlife Service. But we also have a database manager and a GIS mapping person from Birds Canada who work a good chunk of their time on designing the database, managing that database, setting up the whole thing for data entry and analysis. And the whole map production, of course, being an Atlas, mapping is a huge part of the project. And so we have staff working away on that at Birds Canada. Over the course of the project, we will hire a lot of field crews to fill in the gaps where the volunteers aren't going, both in Southern Ontario and in the north. They'll probably be mostly working in Central Ontario, but somewhat in the north as well. We have 47 volunteer regional coordinators across the province, and they're sort of the backbone of the project. All of the volunteers work through the regional coordinators. They're the ones who screen the data at the local level. And we don't know how many volunteers we're going to have this time. We had over 3,000 last time, and we're expecting we should have at least that many this time, but we haven't really started yet that major outreach process. So we'll learn in the next few months how many people are interested. So the setup for the project, I mentioned the region. So region 4 here with the dark outline is around the London area. And they're sort of roughly based on counties, but they're more, they're sort of around counties, but trying to base around where nature clubs are and that kind of thing so that in each case we can have a single regional coordinator that can oversee things and work with the different groups that are operating in that area. And so you can see those 10 by 10 kilometer squares, and the data collection on the Atlas is all about 10 by 10 kilometer squares. Our goals are to cover each one of those squares in southern Ontario and a scattering of them in the north. And we want to get 20 hours of effort in each one of those squares and basically find as many as possible of the birds that are nesting in each one of those squares. And so the volunteers will get a map like this with a PDF of their square. We now have an app that will allow them to have all the maps in at once, or to look at large numbers of maps at the same time. Wherever they are in the province, they'll be able to pull up a map of their square. And on here, of course, they've got all the topographic information they need to find all the species that are in the square. You can see the little numbered pluses throughout. Those are point counts, and that's a more precise way of collecting information on the number of birds in the square. Those are randomly located on roadsides. There are 50 of them pointed out there, and the volunteer's job is to go out and do a 5-minute point count on 25 of those points. In cases like in this square, where the roadside layer doesn't fully represent the habitats of the square, they're also given an assignment of covering some extra points. So in this case, out of their 25 points, you see the red bar across the bottom, they're supposed to cover 2 additional point counts in deciduous forests, 1 in coniferous, et cetera, et cetera. So that way, these 25 point counts give us the best possible cross-section of the abundance of the birds in that square. And so the data collection, when they're not counting birds, they're looking for breeding evidence. And it's basically standardized codes. They were devised in Europe. They've been adapted to North America. And we're going to use pretty much the same codes in Atlas-3 that we used in Atlas-2 and Atlas-1. So the birders go out into the field. They look for birds that are exhibiting breeding evidence. And it can be as simple as, in this case, an H, which is the bird is there in its suitable habitat in its breeding season. And that would go down as a possible breeder. The simplest way of getting it up to a probable breeder is to go back a week later, and the same bird is in the same location in its nesting habitat in the nesting season. So that's it becomes then a territory holder, and it gets a code as a T and becomes a probable breeder. Now there's a number of probable breeding codes. I won't go into all of them, but just stronger evidence of breeding would list them as a probable breeder. Ultimately, we're hoping to get as many as possible of confirmed breeders. So it could be, you could see this yellow warbler with food in its bill away from the nest and still classify that as a confirmed breeder for the square, because obviously it's gathering food to feed its young. But obviously we're working towards finding nests and occupied nests and nests with young for as many species as possible. So in terms of the overall targets then, the 3 darker shades of green at the bottom here is what we define as Southern Ontario. And our goal is to get, as I said earlier, the 20 hours of coverage minimum in each one of those 10 by 10 kilometer squares. We found last time we well exceeded that minimum. South of the Canadian Shield, we had something like, and I forget the exact number, but 50, 60 hours per square. It's about 1,000 squares down there, so lots of effort there. This graphic actually shows the different layers that we use for point counts targets. And so at least in Atlas-2, our goal was to cover the dark green golden horseshoe area there. We wanted to get point counts in every one of those squares. And I should say, to do point counts, you've got to be quite a skilled birder, and not all the birders that participate have the level of skill required to do point counts. You have to know your birdsong well. And so they're sort of targeting higher levels of coverage in more populated areas. So then the rest of the Southern Shield, we're hoping for half the squares. The rest of Southern Ontario, the Southern Shield there, looking for a quarter of the squares. And then in the north, in this road accessible north, we're looking for basically 5% of the squares up there to be adequately covered, and then to get these minimum of 25 point counts. And in the remote north, the pale blue on top, we're aiming for a minimum of 2% of the squares up there. And 2% doesn't sound like much, but it's a huge effort to get enough crews in. There are actually 50 of those 100-kilometer blocks in the north, and we need to get 50 hours of coverage in each one of those, and getting all the people up there is going to keep us more than busy. Okay, so in the end, the Atlas-2 resulted in a book. I should mention that we haven't yet decided if we're doing a book for this project or if everything will go onto a website in book format or something similar to book format that people can access readily. But as I said, we haven't really made that decision yet. Ultimately, though, the information will be more or less the same that goes in there. Although, of course, with the new technologies, there'll be a lot of different things that we can do, and I'll mention a few of those as we go through. So this is the sort of layout of the book. The first, see if this animation works. Oh, great, it's working. So the map at the bottom left here is our breeding evidence maps. So those breeding evidences that I mentioned earlier, possible, probable, confirmed, they show up as different shades of red on here, from that sort of pale orange through to the dark red. And this map, so it shows you the current distribution of the birds across the province. The black dots on here indicate that the species was reported in the second atlas, but not in the first atlas, so that you can see in the case of the barn swallow, there's a significant decline of the barn swallows up in the Algonquin Park area, and actually right further north, right throughout the southern part of the province there. There are not very many obvious ones here, but there are actually yellow dots on there that that show that the species occurred in the second atlas, but not in the first. But not many of those for the barn swallow. Okay, and then the map at the top right shows us the relative abundance of the species. That's based on these point counts, so that you can see it gives you a lot more detail than the map in the bottom left as to where the birds are concentrated. That was based, last time we had tremendous success. We had 68,000 of those point counts done and got really great coverage throughout the province, but basically meeting our targets across the province. We were the first atlas in North America to do these point counts, and we would have been the first to repeat the point counts, but one of the American atlases is jumping ahead of us by shortening their interval. And so we will probably be the second in North America to be able to compare those maps of relative abundance between atlases. And really, this is going to be a huge leap forward. This is the thing I'm looking forward to most at the end of the atlas, that is going to tell us in more detail than we've ever had what the current distribution of these birds is, but how that's changed over the previous 20 years. We will be collecting information on the probability of observation. I won't spend too much on that, other than to say it allows us to compare abundances of the birds between the atlases for species that don't show up well on point counts. In the next atlas, we will actually be mapping the information on this, so that we'll not only be able to map the species, the relative abundance of species that we get on point counts, but also some of the other species that aren't covered well on point counts. And then in the book and on the website in the end, we have experts sit down and write these species accounts that give people information on, as it says here, the distribution and population status and abundance of the bird. I think the last thing is today, yes, at least we know we're doing a website next time, and still unclear whether or not we're going to be producing a book. Okay, so how do people contribute to this? We are developing an app. It's gone through a lot of testing, still got more tweaking to go, but so now people can collect data right on their phone. They will be able to just submit data to a website, though, for people who don't like phones, and you can even just sort of fill out data forms in the field on paper and then go back and enter the data in the computer if you like. Or in some cases, there are organizations that have that can provide spreadsheets of their data in a compatible form, and we can certainly take data in a downloaded format like that. Data collection is mostly when most of the birds are breeding, May through July, but in fact, anytime that birds are nesting. So great horned owls out there calling in January, they're setting up, they're on territory at that point. Those birds are eligible to be reported, right through to waxwings and goldfinches that are nesting through into September. We can still be recording data on those that late in the season. So data can be collected anywhere. So just about anywhere in the province is suitable breeding habitat for something. And then different ways that people can actually submit data. So if you have, say, an osprey on a platform behind your office, that data can go in as a casual breeding evidence record, an incidental record, and there'll be a way of just entering information on that one record alone, without collecting other information as well. So you don't have to be expert in the project, you just have to be sure of the identity of the records that you're submitting. If you find something significant in your area, again, you could just send information specifically on that, but you will be asked for details on that. And you have to be able to defend the identity of the bird and the information that you've provided on it. You can also, of course, get involved more generally in the project, go out there in the field and collect information on the birds nesting around your area or obviously anywhere in the province. And I'll talk a little bit more about these checklists, which is the new way we're collecting data. You can also put out these autonomous recording units, and we know these are going to be very important in Northern Ontario, but we're starting to think about how they might be helpful in the South. They're basically a listening device you nail to a tree, and you can program it to listen at different times of the day, at different times of the night, for up to months at a time. So a great way of getting information on birds that are nesting in these areas that are hard to find. And there's a whole process behind all that, but we are thinking that those would be very helpful to have. And as I said, the point counts there. We have to be a high skill level of birder to participate doing those. So what's special about the Atlas? It is a huge project, a lot of people involved, putting out an enormous amount of effort. We did have all those point counts. We did last time accumulate something like 22,000 records of significant species. The data is very carefully screened by regional coordinators, by our expert committees, and it's all in a data set that's available for people who want to get at it. As you've seen, it's very broad. We're covering the whole province. We cover all the species in the province, unlike a lot of the other projects. We focus on getting information on species at risk, and the job of the Atlas is to find all the species in the square, so they're going about looking for these poorly known birds. And of course, the Atlas requires people to get into parts of the province that aren't normally covered. It does provide a great context for other work, for species assessment, environmental assessments, different surveys that just as a background work that you might be wanting to do. It's a very helpful data set for research, for environmental assessments, establishing habitat relationships. We're thinking this time, we're already thinking about how the data might be analyzed to look at climate change and land use effects. Obviously, those things have changed a lot since the last Atlas, and we want to look at how that's affected the bird populations. Yeah. Population estimates we talked about earlier, but also we're hoping that the whole point of the Atlas is to collect information that's going to be useful for directing conservation efforts. And of course, it's going to give us all this information on change over time. It is very thorough, although it's very broad, it's very fine scale too. We got those point counts that are very precise, and I'll talk about our checklist approach in a moment. Okay, so we're collecting data this time. I should say in the last Atlas, people sent data in for a 10 by 10 kilometer square. This time, I'm not sure if you're familiar with eBird, but basically you go out in the field and it tracks your movement, and then you attach a list of birds to that. So in the case of this, if you look at the bottom left here, the track on the trail in the Saugeen Conservation Area, the birder went out, made a specific track as they were walking through that area, and a list of birds that were collected on that track and the breeding evidence and the number of birds of each species is attached to that. And so you can see the potential here for data being very useful for conservation areas, for parks and others. You can also just do a stationary point count. A stationary point, be it a point count or just standing around looking at birds, or you can, in the case of the top right there, you can do a track on a road. You can have just somebody wander down a road. Whatever way it works for them, we're encouraging the atlasers to do short lists, not spend 10 kilometers walking around a square and then send all that in on one list. And that way, by getting them, we're sort of aiming for 2 kilometers or less on most of our lists, getting more precise information on where the birds are. And we're in the process of working out the extent to which we'll encourage them to go to spend time in conservation areas and protected areas, so we can compare information inside and out of those areas. So the Atlas, there's sort of a very rough timeline for the whole thing, but basically we're in the process now of in the fall of 2020, just tweaking the design, getting all that done. Once we finish the design, we'll get the materials prepared, and we're going to start soon recruiting and training. Excuse me, the volunteers.
Hey, Mike, we just have a quick question.
Yeah. Okay.
So Tara just asked, how are you measuring land use change as the first question? And then the second question is, the remote monitoring unit is interesting. Would that be something that would become available to consultants who are doing breeding bird surveys as part of development to supplement their biological data? So back to the first one. So how are you measuring land use change?
Yeah, we're actually in the process of trying to work that out. We just had a presentation the other day from the Ministry of Natural Resources, who's trying to pull together all the data sets on land use change, all of the spatial information that's out there now. And they're telling us that we should, by 2022, they should have a pretty good province-wide picture that will allow us to compare the current land use with that from 20 years ago. We can already do that in parts of the province, but it's not seamless. It's not handled in the same way across the whole province, and so it looks like it'll be a couple of years from now before we can do that in a relatively straightforward way. But yeah, the information that we're using is going to be the word's escaping me, but basically whatever information is the best that Ministry of Natural Resources has, based on satellite imagery. I think some of it's based on air photos. Whatever they're using in that part of the province is basically what the Atlas will be using. And then the other question was about ARUs. We have a committee, a working group looking at ARUs and how best to use them. I don't think we're going to be in a position of having ARUs that we hand out to other people to use. We'll probably be encouraging people to acquire them. We may have a certain number that can get used. Some of the nature clubs already have ARUs. Ministry of Natural Resources has them that they're sort of lending to the project or using for the project as we go forward. And it's possible, what we did last time, we had some funds that we set aside some money so that volunteers could purchase, at that time it was GPS units, and we gave them some money towards the purchase of GPS units. We might be doing something similar this time with ARUs, we just haven't got that far in our discussions yet.
And would remote monitoring data be something that would be available to consultants who are doing breeding bird surveys as part of development or to supplement their biological data? Yeah,
it will all be, well, I won't say all of it will be available because there's just a huge amount of terabytes and upon terabytes of data, and we're yet to sort of work out how we're going to deal with those volumes of data. There is something through the University of Alberta, something called Wild Tracks. They have a system for managing those recordings, and we're working out with them, and they're in the process too of developing exactly how we can make these kind of things accessible. And I really can't tell you the full story on it because we're not really there yet. But in terms of the data that gets used directly in the Atlas, I expect that will be readily available. I can't see any reason it wouldn't be. The rest of the data on those ARUs would, I don't know. At this point, I'm not sure.
Hey, Mike, it's Joanne here.
Yeah.
We've got about 15 minutes or so. We can carry on a little bit past 11, but just wanted to let you know.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my clock disappears when I'm on full screen mode. Okay. So we're getting to the meat now of the thing in terms of we know about the Atlas and why are we interested in conservation areas. The CAs, they do have a lot of unique and interesting habitats. The reservoirs, often extensive areas of grassland, riparian habitats. I just wanted to mention that Luther Marsh was the richest square in the Atlas, in the first Atlas, and pretty close second in the second Atlas. But the conservation areas also allow people to get to off-road habitats quite readily. So much private land in Southern Ontario that people can't get at, that we're interested in getting at those off-road areas. Often the CAs and conservation authorities have very knowledgeable staff that would be interested in getting involved in collecting data within their conservation areas or their lands, and making that sort of thing available to us. And just to say that the conservation areas and the conservation lands in the province do make a significant contribution to Ontario bird conservation. So we're just interested in helping make sure they get useful data that's good for them and that helps us in this overall bird conservation effort. So what we're thinking that where the data might be useful for you guys is it's gonna help understand, sort of provide context to the birds in the conservation area and conservation lands in comparison to the rest of the landscape. Should be useful for plan review and that kind of thing. We've got restoration projects, that checklist and point count information will be useful for pinpointing where birds are in relation to that. We're going to have lots of information on species at risk, including things like bank swallows along rivers that are likely to become an issue with conservation authorities. And yeah, there's the potential here to look at conservation areas and as a whole, and to some extent locally, how they contribute to bird conservation there. And then, of course, all this new information that will be available for your interpretive programs, like it says here, information on new species, how things are changing, what's popular, what the impacts of climate change and such are. What we can get from ARUs and that kind of thing. So in terms of roles of the conservation authorities, we've got this sort of new concept we haven't actually implemented yet, but we're thinking of, called the Friends of the Atlas, and we're wondering if Conservation Ontario and conservation authorities might want to be part of that. It's a bit of a vague concept at this point, but the idea is to have a group of folks who are interested in the Atlas, are interested in helping us figure out how to do it, and at the same time, not have the responsibilities of the folks that are on our actual management committee. We have Atlas committees. I mentioned some of those. Some of the ones that might be a particularly good fit for your folks might be the communications committee on our Indigenous engagement committee. Sort of leapt out at me as potentially interesting. In order to collaborate properly, it would be helpful to have maps of conservation areas, and we have some of those, in the open data. Some of those are available. It turns out some aren't, and so I might want to talk to you about that. Mention data collection by staff. We are very interested in seeing if we could get free access for volunteers who are going to collect data in conservation areas, either for just collecting the data or camping and staying overnight. Often they're well located in places that it would be helpful to have people be able to stay so they can cover the surrounding area as well. We would like to run some events through conservation areas. Typically, we run a launch at the Courtright Centre north of Toronto. And it looks like this year we might be wanting to do something down at Fanshawe Conservation Area and potentially others across the province. We're quite interested in getting materials into conservation areas for birders to pick up, so that if they haven't heard about the Atlas, so posters and that kind of thing. And maybe if you have some access to social media, you might be sharing things that would be helpful to us. Again, this idea of autonomous recording units are other things that we might be able to help make happen. And then there's probably other things, and this is why it'd be good to hear from you folks. So just to sort of wrap up, we're about to launch this big project. Lots of birders ready to go across the province, going to provide a valuable database for us. We have done it twice. We want to do this the third time. It looks like this one can be better than ever, and we're looking forward to doing it and hoping to get collaboration from groups like yourselves in helping make that happen. Okay, and then we talked a little bit about next steps in this whole thing. So if you have any questions we can't answer today, please get back to us. We are interested in the idea of your endorsing the Atlas, just saying this is a good idea, and particularly this notion of our volunteers getting access to the conservation areas for data collection purposes. And thinking the way to go about this is we'll have this presentation today. This recording will be available for the others. And the hope is that you guys can talk about this, and we'll send you some more information summarizing some of the stuff I've said today, and laying out more precisely what we're after, and then hoping you guys can talk about this and get back to us. So I think that's mostly it, Joanne. Yeah, just some contact info here. If you do have follow-up stuff you want to ask. I should have put Kaylin's on here too. But anyway, I'll deflect everything that comes into Kaylin anyway.
We'll make sure Kaylin's contact information is available when we get that written message out.
Okay.
And the link to the webinar recording. Does anyone have any questions? I think we'll keep it to the chat right now.
Oh, sorry. There was actually just a quick question regarding the data flow between eBird and the Atlas, and kind of how that worked, whether eBird data would go into the Atlas. Yeah, I'll leave that to Mike. I kind of answered briefly in the chat, but for anyone who's going to be watching this later on.
Yeah, that's sort of the million-dollar question at the moment. We actually just formed a group to help us figure out exactly how best to do that. Certainly, the one thing I can say for certain is that the data that's collected by the Atlas using the app will be and entered in on the web page will be able to just flow right into eBird, and we've already got that working. We've been testing this over the last few days, and my checklists on the Atlas app are there next day in eBird. So that much is happening. The question we're debating is how much do we just accept eBird data into the Atlas? And there are a lot of things the Atlas app does that eBird doesn't. So we're leaning towards encouraging everybody very much to use the Atlas app. And what we're debating at the moment is how much of the strictly eBird data do we let in? And it's not, I can't give you a firm answer at that right at the moment.
So I see a question here from Zachary Khan about how CA is actually go about potentially joining one of the Atlas committees. At this point in time, Mike, what do you think? I know that previous times, sounds like it's hard to hear me. Can people hear me?
Yeah, you are cutting in and out a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that any better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. I'll speak closer to the thing. I've had this problem before, so we'll see what's going on with my technology. But we on occasion do have a process by which, if Conservation Ontario representing all CAs, it made sense to participate on a committee. That's one way to do that. But if individual individuals want to participate on a committee, Mike, how would you propose they do that?
They should drop me an email and explain more who they are and what they're interested in. We can take it from there. I put up a brief outline of what the communications committee does here. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to look at that. And then we have something similar for the Indigenous Engagement Group. And the communications committee is pretty well established at this point and working away. The Indigenous Engagement Group is coming together. They have had a number of meetings and almost at the point now we're going to start some outreach to the Indigenous communities.
So we have another question that is, are you interested in older breeding bird records from the last few years in conservation areas that can help guide volunteers on locations of birds that might be missed otherwise?
Boy, that's a good question. Yes, I think that kind of thing would be of considerable interest. The mechanism I would suggest there would be to provide that information to our regional coordinator. The regional coordinators, although we have most of them established, they're just getting into their work and things are in the development stage, but they could use that information. They would inform the person who's going to be doing most of the atlasing, not all the atlasing probably, in that square of that, and they could go and check out that information. So if you have specifics, let us know and we can put you in touch with the regional coordinator for that.
Any other questions? Here's one. It's about, it's from Tim Trustum at Quinty. Should we offer collaboration with our local naturalist clubs? That is, should we have a standardized access to CA property agreement?
Something like that sounds good. I think in our case, the naturalist clubs would be a good approach. Our regional coordinators probably slightly better because they're more specifically tied to the atlas, but they will be in the great majority of cases working closely with their local nature clubs. So either way would probably work. It may be best to try and do something more directly with the regional coordinator.
Yeah. The other thing that I've been thinking about, and we might not make a decision about this today, but regarding Mike's request for a collective Conservation Ontario endorsement, the idea that Tim's raised about, you know, if there are enough of the CAs who feel that we should endorse the Atlas, but also endorse conservation area access, free access, and provide some kind of a template agreement or something that CAs can use, because we do draft templates for CAs to use. That's something to think about. We're not making a decision about that today, but it's certainly something that you can think about. We might discuss perhaps with the conservation areas working group, if there are any members there, or that group that are in attendance today. A lot of ways to look at it and partner.
So we have another question. Will volunteers and/or technicians be used to process ARU data, or will you be taking a more automated approach?
I suspect it will largely be done by contractors. There are lots of folks now who are doing this already for a living, or a good chunk of their living, listening to these things. The Wild Tracks is developing a system for sort of crowdsourcing this analysis approach, and I think that's something we'd be very interested in. We're not there yet, but it is something we would definitely be looking into, because as I said, there's so much data. There's no possibility of getting someone to listen to all of it. And then you mentioned the automatic approach. So far, it's only possible to identify a few birds. The computers aren't as smart as we are when it comes to identifying birds. And despite a lot of effort, the progress is quite slow there, but it is coming along. And this system of wild tracks, because it has so much used data and using artificial intelligence, they are training their computers one species at a time to be able to identify them. So for something like a nighthawk that just goes beep, it's fairly straightforward to identify that, and there are already algorithms in place that do that. But maybe by the time the Atlas is over, we'll have it for a lot more of those species. And certainly I would think 20 years from now, the great advantage to these ARU data sets is they'll be there forever. And once you do figure all of that out automatically, you'll be able to run all of those that process all of them through that system and learn a lot more than we currently know about where all these birds are.
Any other questions? Give it a minute for someone to type in. Okay, well, we did make it under the wire. So there's definitely an opportunity to follow up directly with Mike. We will be sending a message, written information from Mike through to CAs that highlight the value of the Atlas and how CAs and CO can collaborate, the recording, of course. And so we're looking forward to hearing from you if you have any ideas in the meantime about how you think CAs or CO collectively could collaborate. Please let me know. If you please also let us know how you thought the webinar went. We're just starting to use Zoom at CO as a platform for even our council meetings. So looking forward to hearing how you feel this went as well, just as a webinar. I know my volume or my speaker issue is a problem, so we'll have to work on that. But that is it. Thank you so much to all of you for participating. We had a really good turnout, and from a broad range of CAs. And thank you to Mike and Kaylin and Kristen for your help.
So yes, thanks everybody. Appreciate your listening in today, and thanks Joanne and folks for running this.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
And